everybody. Katy Lees here, Principal 340B Compliance Advisor with Virtue 340B. I wanted to come on today and maybe dial it down a little bit. A lot of my videos lately have been really focused on like the hot topics and the chaos of the 340B program, but I thought today we'd just talk about some more standard elements of the 340B program, what a good faith inquiry looks like, disclosures to a manufacturer, talk a little bit about material breach and what that process of issuing repayments to manufacturers might look like. In the past, we've talked about what it looks like to have a strong compliance plan of managing your program, of monitoring your program, identifying any potential issues. But I don't think we've really gotten into what those next steps are. So first, I'll talk about good faith inquiries. So these have become more and more common lately. It does depend on your entity type, your entity size, maybe how often you are hearing from a manufacturer with questions, or maybe they come through a third party where they send you claims for review that the manufacturer has, a third party of the manufacturer. But again, become more and more common, and it's an important part of the process, right? Like, it may feel like a bother. Sometimes it feels, like kind of an aggressive situation, but it is an important part of the process. Like, we all do need to work together. If a manufacturer has concerns about a program, they have a right to ask questions. They have limited visibility into, these transactions, what may or may not be a duplicate discount, if there's a diversion issue that's going on. So they do have a right to ask these questions, and it's really important that we all find a space to work together and answer these questions. Again, assuming everything is being handled in a reasonable way, we do need to answer these questions. So I thought, we'll just touch on this a little bit. If anyone is interested in hearing more, certainly, reach out to me. You can always reach out to Virtue 340B. This is certainly an area that we're able to help covered entities, or, just throw something in the chat, or look me up on LinkedIn if you want to hear more in a future video. I'm also happy to do that. So yeah, good faith inquiries. These could come as a letter in the mail, a phone call, an email, just some way that the manufacturer is reaching out to a covered entity to say, hey, we've seen a change in your purchasing patterns, or we are receiving all of these rebate requests from the state Medicaid agency, but we see that you carve in. So I would assume that you're buying everything at 340B, so we shouldn't have to pay a rebate. There's lots of different reasons that the manufacturer might be triggered to reach out with a good faith inquiry. So the first step is just really understanding, what they're seeing, why they're reaching out. And so the way I view these is it's a great double check for the entity to make sure, okay, maybe it really is a problem. It certainly has happened that, in my career, I've gotten these good faith inquiries. It's usually something that's explainable and not an issue, but there have been instances where a problem was highlighted based on that, the manufacturer reaching out with a question. So I think once you receive this notice, which again, it can be a little bit difficult. There's not a great standard process for manufacturers to reach out to covered entities. If there's anyone from the manufacturer community listening, I will say the best route is to find the primary contact listed on the HRSA database for each covered entity. That is going to be the ideal person. They may not have all the answers, but I think that they should probably be the best option to get you the answers. And unfortunately, emails are not available on that website. So it's either going to be the address or the phone number of the primary contact. So sometimes, snail mail can be a little bit challenging, but however the inquiry gets to you, my first step is to confirm receipt. So if I receive a letter, I would say I'd be shocked if the letter didn't have an email. So from there, that's how I'm going to correspond, is via email. I would send, a probably a scanned version of the letter, just say confirming receipt of this, we are looking into it. The most important thing is just the communication. So you want to let them know you received it, and I think that any reasonable person knows you're not immediately going to have an answer. So just stay in contact. Maybe it's an easy thing that it'll take you a week to respond. If you know this, you could even say that, in your response, or maybe if it's going to take a little longer, say, I will get back to you by the end of the month. And even if you don't have a complete answer by the end of the month, try to keep that communication open so that you're checking back in. Say, hey, I'm trying to get the information. I don't quite have it yet. I will let you know as soon as I do. I think that's a really important part of the process, is just communicating, what you're able to do, what your timeline looks like, if you're encountering delays or any barriers. That's an important part of the process. And next, take that information. If maybe the inquiry says, hey, we've seen an increase in your purchases over the last 6 months, and we're concerned that it could be diversion. So, that's a valid concern. If maybe right off the bat why there's an increase in purchases, and it's, a completely valid reason of why your purchases has increased. Even if that's the case, I'd like to go look at the data myself. I'm going to pull the purchasing data and make sure that I see that in mine. And then also just look at, okay, so what's leading to those purchases? Again, maybe you already know and you don't need to do too much digging. It's valid and you can send back an explanation. But maybe you're like, oh, I'm not sure. There could be an issue. Maybe your software something has changed and you weren't aware until you got that. So definitely good. Don't just answer and say everything's fine. Use this as a double check. Make sure that you're validating that everything is fine. And I guess I should also add here that it depends on the inquiry and your level of comfort in responding just one-on-one or without escalating this within your organization. There's certainly, we live in a world these days, unfortunately, that a lot of this probably should be run by your legal counsel or your compliance office, or just through hopefully every 340B covered entity has a 340B steering committee. So maybe this is something that, if you meet monthly or quarterly or on whatever cadence, this is something you would bring to them. If you won't be meeting anytime soon, escalate it via email. Just make sure that you are doing all of the right steps and that you are providing the right responses to the manufacturers, but also, within reason. They certainly don't need to know business that they don't need to know, again, especially the world that we live in today, unfortunately. But the most important thing is to, look into the compliance concern and make sure there isn't a concern and respond with the appropriate information. If you do see that, oh crap, this is a problem, then, there's a process to be followed there too. So then, maybe, again, keeping the conversation open with the manufacturer, just keeping them updated so you don't ghost them for 90 days or something if this takes a long time. But, if you then do discover that this was a problem, so now you need to go back to, your process of when you uncover a potential issue, doing a root cause analysis. So what is causing this issue? Why, if purchases are all of a sudden elevated and they shouldn't be, what's causing the additional purchases? So, once you identify that issue, obviously that needs to be fixed. And then what was the full scope of this? How long was that issue in place? How much of these purchases were problematic? So, and I'm not saying that it's super common that it truly is going to be an issue. Hopefully you're able to just answer their question. You have valid, transactions that support all of those purchases, and that's the end of it. But if that's not the case, then, you need to go through this process of making sure you understand the full issue. And then in a couple minutes, we'll talk about, disclosures and repayments. But basically, just to kind of somewhat close the loop on the good faith inquiries, I think the most important thing is just making sure that you're communicating efficiently. So communicating with the manufacturers, communicating internally to make sure that you keep, your internal leadership, or if you feel appropriate, legal counsel, anyone that should be involved, just review these, each inquiry individually and however you see appropriate, but it really is, we can't ignore these. We have to respect these inquiries and answer them and work through the process as best we can. So if you do identify an issue, again, whether it be based on their inquiry or maybe based on your own internal auditing, you discover that you have an issue. Again, you go through, you identify the full scope of it, all of the transactions you've determined maybe you should not have purchased at 340B. Now you need to disclose that to the manufacturer. Again, it's either going to be in response to them reaching out to you, or you need to, initiate the conversation saying that you have identified an issue. So if you're initiating the conversation, again, going back to who's the right person to reach out to, it's the same with a covered entity. So if you need to reach out to the manufacturer, your best bet is to go to the OPA database and find the primary contact for that manufacturer. So again, it's not going to be an email available, but they will have the address and a phone number. So my process has always been, just writing up a letter. It doesn't have to be super detailed, because what I found is even if you put every single detail in there, including NDCs and units, that's still going to be requested later. So I tend to just leave these letters, the initial reach out, somewhat brief. It's just easier that way, because again, you're going to get into the details later. So I'm not sure that those initial disclosure letters need to be overly detailed, but you could put, you certainly want to identify the covered entity. You want to say briefly, like, we have identified an issue as a result of our internal audits, or maybe it's a result of a HRSA audit, or however it was identified. And then, there will be an exchange that ensues from there once they receive that disclosure. And again, if you're already, engaged with them about the good faith inquiry, what happens next is you need to identify the NDCs and the invoices that are in scope of that. So I guess that usually happens, I guess I'm jumping ahead, before the disclosure, because you need all of that specific detail to know which manufacturers that you need to disclose the issue to. And you want to make sure that you are focused on those specific purchases, because that's what you're repaying. So yes, you have an issue, you have transactions, maybe prescriptions, whatever, that accumulated incorrectly or whatever the issue was, but it's that purchasing data. You're going to use that to get to the purchases that you should not have taken those discounts on, which can be a little bit challenging. But again, that's definitely something Virtue 340B can help with, or I'm sure there's many sources for help with that. But that's really what that conversation is going to come to with a manufacturer, is what purchases should not have received the discount. And then, it's going to be what you bought it for. So if this happened a year ago, it will be what you were invoiced for that drug a year ago, compared to most likely what the wholesale acquisition cost was for that drug also a year ago, which that can be kind of challenging. I mean, I wouldn't spend too much time trying to come up with that information, because in my experience, the manufacturers are going to usually come up with the exact price point that 340B price should be compared to for the repayment. Certainly for your own purposes and just to be prepared and have an estimate of what those repayments look like, I would say for ease, just use current WAC cost. And maybe you have historical, but depending on the size of the disclosure, how many NDCs, what your resources are, maybe you just don't have the time for that. So at least you can get an initial estimate of what those repayments look like by using the current WAC cost. And then they're also just at that point through this conversation, they're probably going to want to get some more detail on what the issue was that, came up that resulting in this disclosure. And, of course, they'll want some assurance that the issue has been resolved going forward. And I'm probably not going in the best order, jumping around a little, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about material breach too in this, because if you identify an issue, whatever leads you to identifying an issue, part of that analysis, once you see that issue is what's the threshold of that? Like, what is the size of that issue? Everyone in the 340B community or covered entities participating in the 340B program should have a material breach defined in their policies. And what this means is you're defining if we have a compliance issue that reaches a certain threshold, then we will have to disclose that to HRSA. So HRSA has not defined that for covered entities. They just ask that covered entities define it, and then once you have that in your policies, you follow that. So if you say that, our material breach threshold is 5% of all of our 340B purchases in a 12-month period, and we can't resolve this organically in, 60 days, then that means that we need to disclose the issue to HRSA. So that's one example of what your material breach threshold is. But every covered entity should have that defined. And again, once you're over that, that's when you disclose it to HRSA. Now, that doesn't necessarily, correspond with when you disclose it to manufacturers, because there really is no threshold there. If you identify that there is an issue and that you owe a repayment to a manufacturer, they need to be notified. So, that doesn't come into play for the material breach. You need to, if you identify an issue and, for the past year that you've been over replenishing something, but it doesn't hit the material breach, you still need to identify the impact of manufacturers and notify them. So those are two separate things. And there's, that distinction between material breach and just, when the obligation to notify manufacturers. And again, then once you, get to that point and you're working through the repayments, it's just important to be organized and have those details. So be prepared, to have all of that purchasing data. If you are doing a disclosure to a large number of manufacturers, it can get a little complicated. If you send out, let's say you send out 10 letters, and it might take a week and you get back 3 responses. 2 weeks later, you get back 3 more responses. You just want to be prepared. Have your purchasing data ready ahead of time so that as each of those responses come in, you have the invoice details, you have your estimated repayments. You should already, have your summary of what the issue was. Some manufacturers may want to schedule a call to talk about it. Others, it will be a very quick, email exchange. And then they'll make arrangements to have you send them those repayments for those discounts that you should not have taken. So yeah, I think that was all that I wanted to cover. I hope that was helpful. Happy to answer any questions if anyone has any, as always. And of course, everyone is always welcome to reach out to us at Virtue 340B. We're happy to help, overall with your compliance needs, but certainly, if you have issues that come up and you need help there too. So I hope everyone has a great day. Bye.